This is Distant Replay.
It's time for another true crime edition of the podcast. Welcome into Distant Replay. I'm Ben George. He is Mike Noto. Mike, we got Maury Lerner on the docket today. A name that I am not familiar with, but this could be the oldest story we go back to.
Good point, Ben, because this is definitely the oldest case that we've done on the True Crime Sports series. It combines athletic ability, great hitter, also with mob ties as a hitman. So it kind of was a unique story from the perspective of what he was involved in, when he was involved in it, and sort of how his story ended up playing out.
I got you. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing this one today. It's got a lot of elements that I'm interested in, so I think this one could be very, very intriguing. If you haven't found us before, you can listen to us on wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow us, subscribe, and hit us on YouTube as well. You'll find all of our shows on YouTube. We've got a great following there. I appreciate everybody's comments, recommendations, all the support over on YouTube. Please subscribe, like this video, leave a comment if you have thoughts on this story or anything that we do. We'd love to hear from you. And then also on Twitter and Instagram, you'll find us as well. So as we jump into every true crime story, we begin with a little background on the athlete in case you don't know.
Yeah, so Maury Lerner was a baseball player, okay? He's from Brookline, Massachusetts. Most of his crime is associated and connected back to the New England area. So we're talking Providence and Boston area specifically. His nickname was Pro, so people called him Pro, so Pro Lerner, maybe a name that if you Google him, he'll be under as well. Very good high school player. Drafted at 18 by the Washington Senators. And after he's drafted by the Washington Senators, had a brief season with the low A team. You know how those low A teams play like a half a season?
Yeah.
Had a season with the low A team. Then he joined the Marines, okay? When he came back from his service with the Marines in 1957, he had like 3 excellent minor league seasons. Like I'm talking, Ben, he hit like 328, 348, and 372 in 3 minor league seasons.
Dang. Killing it.
He was in the Pittsburgh organization for most of that time, and they had hopes for him to play like second base and shortstop. We're talking like late 50s, early 60s here. And this is when the Pirates were a very good team, you know? So, yeah. I mean, he was like thought to be an upper level prospect. But every time he would get to the point, Ben, where he could be promoted to the major leagues, he would trip himself up. You know what I mean? Yeah. And we're going to go into some of the issues that he ended up being involved in after he retired. But he was also always involved in some like petty issues, whether it was like arguing with a coach, arguing with other players, you know, being suspected of doing certain things, you know, just kind of things when he was just about to get to the major leagues, something would hold him back. His career ended up with him kicking around playing for independent league teams, but always being really good no matter what level he played. So it was never his playing ability that held him back, if that makes sense. It was more the people he associated with and his actions towards teammates and coaches.
I got you.
So we'll get into this true crime story here now. As I mentioned, you know, as a kid and even during his minor league playing career, he was involved in like stealing, petty crimes as a kid. I don't want to make it sound like stealing's not a big deal, but compared to what he was involved in, I'm going to get into here in a couple of minutes, you know, minor crimes that were sort of a precursor to what he would end up doing when he got older. Okay.
Right.
He always had a knack. People would say he was always very cerebral, very thought out, always had a knack for like escape plans and crafting them, really researched his targets well if he was going to rob them, things of that nature. And those are things that he started to do from an early age. All right.
Yeah.
The first time he gets on law enforcement's radar is at the tail end of his playing career in 1961. He was arrested for armed robbery of a furniture store in Boston.
Okay. A little more serious now.
We're getting, as he gets older, now he's older now, his crimes are getting more serious, exactly. He's sentenced to 3 years probation for this incident, okay? Later in 1961, he was arrested for conspiring to commit armed robbery and carrying a firearm without a permit. Basically what happened here, Ben, is he and an associate got caught basically while they were robbing an acquaintance of theirs, okay? When he's brought in question for this is like the only time I could find where he got on law enforcement's radar for sort of being like a wise guy to them, you know?
Yeah.
You know, not admitting what he did, being a wise guy. And as we'll go through later, I think he kind of learned a lesson from this because this is the last time you would hear him like being disrespectful to like law enforcement, for instance.
Okay.
He became a lot more sort of close to the vest after this.
Gotcha.
Okay. Now, some of that might have been taught to him by two very well-known New England-based criminals that he was sort of hanging around with.
That's what I was
So
thinking. That's what I thought you were going to go with that. Like, it sounded like somebody got to him and said, "Hey, let me show you how this is done."
Exactly. Basically, it could have been like this. They saw potential in him.
Yeah.
Like he was a good criminal, right?
Right.
But he just needed to be like honed in a little bit and fine-tuned.
Yeah.
Right. So among the people he was associated with was a guy named John Red Kelly. The association between Lerner and Kelly would be major in Lerner's life, which is why I wanted to mention it here towards the top, okay? Mm-hmm. John Kelly had been on the FBI's radar for quite some time. He was involved in a truck robbery in 1962 where two people dressed up as police officers, they commandeered a U.S. postal truck, which at that point would carry money from place to place, and they made off with $1.5 million during one of those heists. And at the time, it was the largest, in history. It was the largest heist of money in history. So it put Kelly on the radar of the FBI, and because Lerner was hanging out with him, it put him on the radar of the FBI. Now, we'll get more into that postal truck robbery here a little bit later, because Kelly eventually stands trial for that, and there's a whole story attached to that. But meanwhile, during this time with Lerner, he's developing a reputation as a criminal, like a legend, You know how like back then, I think, because the information wasn't as readily available as it is today, that the legend of someone would grow?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Right, yeah. The stories people tell always get a little bit bigger, a little bit deeper, a little more exaggerated.
Exactly. Now, his legend grew as a criminal. Like, for instance, they said that one time he went to go rob someone, and when they answered the door, he had a bat, and because he was a good baseball player, he swung and hit them and really hurt the guy,
Yeah. Yeah.
Like a story like that, Is that stuff true? Who knows? But it got him on people's radar, right? So while Lerner never got the call up, to the major leagues he was hoping for, he did get noticed and did get called up to like the upper echelon of the ranks of crime, right? He does this with his mentor, Kelly. So they work in tandem on a lot of these things that he was involved in from a crime perspective. Now, when you're in New England, Ben, back then, the top of the top, if you're going to talk about crime, was always associated with the Patriarca crime family and their mob boss, Raymond Patriarca. So if we have any people that listen to us, which I'm sure they do, that are somewhat familiar with the mob, they may recognize that name. Okay.
The only guys I know are the ones from The Departed. That's the only group I know.
Yeah, and that's obviously
that came after these guys, I'm sure.
Yeah, it came after these guys, and we're talking. Remember when in that movie they're making reference to the guys down in Providence?
Yeah.
So that would be more of these guys based in. These are real life guys, first of all, and these are the Italian mobsters based out of Providence, led by Raymond Patriarca and the Patriarca crime family. They basically ran all of New England.
Gotcha.
Is a good way to put it.
Okay.
Right. So he got the attention of this Patriarca crime family, and they basically recruited him to do different things for them, him and Kelly, right?
Yeah.
For instance, Ben, there was a mob maker had a bookmaking operation, and that bookmaking operation got robbed. He would go there and basically handle the situation, Mm-hmm. He was always in the conversation when jobs like that were performed. We're talking about people ending up dead, people ending up seriously hurt, etc. We're talking about mob enforcer kind of stuff here that he's getting involved in.
Okay.
He was also thought to be involved in a 1965 killing of a low-level mobster named Robert Rasmussen. Basically, they had thought that Rasmussen was trying to extort money from Kelly. Okay. So what they did was, what the story, an informant told authorities was, Lerner lured the guy to his apartment with like the promise of a business proposition, like a big score kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And when the guy got there, long story short, that guy Rasmussen ended up in a snowbank with a bullet in the back of his head.
Okay.
So these are the kind of things that Kelly is being connected to.
Right.
Okay. Another one real quick for you. Right. So now we're in 1967, and Kelly is standing trial for that mail truck heist that I mentioned before.
Uh-huh.
And there were different members of Kelly's crew that were going to be, called to the witness stand. One of them was a gentleman named Tommy Richards, and he vanished right before the trial. Another Kelly associate would later say that he saw Lerner shoot Richards in the head as Richards pled for his life. Long story short, again, Kelly thought this particular guy, Richards, would not hold up to questioning.
Yeah.
So they basically eliminated the problem, according to this informant. The murder for Richards has never been solved, and Kelly ended up getting acquitted of the mail truck heist.
Yeah. Wow.
So again, this is like stuff like you see in movies, everything I just described.
It's a perfect movie script, yeah.
Yeah, retaliating for a bookmaking operation being robbed. I think we saw it in The Sopranos, didn't we? Or a card game getting robbed. Remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The killing of another mobster because they thought he couldn't keep his mouth shut. You know what I mean? This is all like stuff you see in movies, like coming to real life. One little nugget for you, Ben. Red Kelly during this mail truck trial was represented by F. Lee Bailey.
Ah, interesting.
This is not the first time F. Lee Bailey has come on our radar in one of these podcasts, and I can't remember the other one. Obviously, I think people would recognize F. Lee Bailey a little bit later in his career for being involved in the OJ trial. But he had a lot of high-profile defendants that he represented during his law career. So now everything's sort of building up to an incident that happened in 1968. Okay. In 1968, two people entered Panone's Market in Providence and shot bookmaker Rudy Marfio and his bodyguard and killed them. Okay. Police later discovered the getaway car. So the getaway car was described to them. They found it with two sawed-off shotguns and two .38 caliber pistols still inside. So these guys came into that market, sort of ready to go. Masked, obviously.
Yeah.
Shoot Marfio and his bodyguard, and then basically flee.
Right.
There's no solid leads for a month, but everyone knew, like, if something happened in that area like that, it had to be approved by Patriarca.
Yeah.
Like, no one's going to go out on their own and do something like that because of how much everyone feared him and the people that work for him. All right. He was an extremely powerful individual from that perspective. In 1969, though, the Patriarca family and Lerner specifically ran into like a major problem. All right. John Kelly turned informant after being named as an accomplice to a Brinks truck robbery. So basically what happened is he set up a Brinks truck robbery with a Brinks truck driver. So it was an inside job. And that driver, under scrutiny and questioning at the authorities, fingers Kelly, Kelly almost right away says, well, I want to be put in protective custody, so I'll tell you what I know in exchange for that. So another thing we always see in mob movies, right? Guy gets caught, turns informant. Someone that is trusted and that Lerner trusted, all right? He tells authorities that Lerner was the shooter in the Panone Market shootings. He said how Lerner had a knack for violence and well-crafted escape plans for robberies. He said he's the most dangerous man he had come across in 25 years in the business, and confirms that the Patriarca recruited Lerner to do different jobs for them, and also had recruited Lerner for this specific killing of Marfio and his bodyguard. So now Lerner's in some trouble, as you can imagine. Okay. So this led the FBI to arrest Lerner in his apartment. When they searched the apartment, they found a .45 caliber pistol. Now, Lerner's the type of guy who had such a reputation that we mentioned before that when he's arrested, people feel more comfortable speaking out against him because they're like, look, we're so afraid of this guy. Now that he can't retaliate, we'll talk about him.
Yeah.
And people told stories of him getting kicks from watching people bleed, like really sadistic stuff, like more than your average hitman kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So with stories like that in the backdrop, and him being accused of the murder of two people, he stands trial. The trial featured theatrics like you would read about or see in the movies. It was him and like three other co-conspirators that were on trial. All right. People were threatening prosecutors. A witness disappeared for a day and said they were kidnapped and threatened to not testify against Patriarca and Lerner. When that witness was leaving the stand, he was threatened out loud in court. Like things, again, like you're like, wow, I can't believe this actually happened in real life, So the trial turns into a little bit of a circus from that perspective. After 3 days of deliberation, Lerner is found not only guilty of conspiracy, but he's also found guilty of murder, and he's given 2 life sentences at the age of 34.
Dang, that's crazy.
Now, you would think a guy like this that was involved in so much violence and crime on the outside would go into jail and sort of revert to doing the same thing.
Right, would get in all kinds of trouble. Yeah.
But the reports from prison were the opposite. He was a model inmate, didn't really talk that much, stayed to his fitness regimen, which he was known for when he played as sort of being ahead of the time on his fitness. Mm-hmm. He, quote, conformed strictly to the rules of the institution, according to the prison, the different write-ups that I found in my research. He wouldn't get involved in prison fights. He would go back to his cell when a fight broke out.
Yeah.
He took pride in his work assignments, and then he even saved the life of a prison guard who was being choked by another inmate with a cord.
Wow.
So just like model inmate is probably what they would term this in the prison world.
Right.
During that time also, he kept close to his family. He basically moved his family closer to the prison, and they saw him 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. Like sitting, obviously in the prison, but sitting across from him 5. So, and his wife stayed loyal to him all this time.
Wow.
Now, where his true crime story takes a twist is, while he's in prison, after serving 18 years, Red Kelly came forward and said that he embellished his testimony in the Marfio murder trial, which obviously that's what Lerner was in jail for. He says the events of the crime went down the same way he described. So he said Lerner killed those 2 people, but that Patriarca, the mob boss, didn't put him up to it, and didn't put Lerner up to it. Okay, that was enough. So that perjury, the way Red Kelly perjured himself, was enough to get Lerner's conviction overturned. And Kelly's story was that an FBI agent, like a corrupt FBI agent, put him up to it to say that Patriarca was the one who told Lerner to kill Marfio, as a way to sort of, get the mob boss on something,
Yeah.
He lived the rest of his life in California and Nevada. The wife who had stayed loyal to him all those years ended up dying a couple years after Lerner was released. He stayed close to his family, in the years after he was released. So he was released when he was 53 years old. And he ended up dying in 2013.
Wow.
I just thought this was a crazy story with the violence he was involved in, but how he basically seemed to morph into like this cerebral person who wasn't that personable. Like, he wasn't standoffish, but very quiet, very reserved, never talked, by the way. So when he was in jail, there was numerous times where authorities would try to get him to talk against the Patriarca family to maybe reduce his sentence or for favors in the prison, but he never talked. And by all accounts, he was just a very sort of, it might have come off as cold, where he just wouldn't get into many conversations with people, sort of did his time, and ended up getting out because of that technicality with Kelly perjuring himself.
78 years old, so he lived a pretty long life. I think it's like one of those guys, you've seen these guys, Mike, that like in terms of violence in like this crime underworld, like they are specifically honed in on the people involved, right? Anything outside of that, they seem like people that are only up and up, right? Like they're very straightforward, probably well-mannered, probably address you well, probably help you out, carry your groceries for you. But when it comes to business, it's like all business. It seemed like he had that switch.
That's a very good way to put it, Ben. I was trying to put my finger on it, but you just described it perfectly. It's like there's a code of rules, and if you break those rules, Maury Lerner's willing to do basically whatever it takes to rectify the situation. But if it's anything outside of that world, I don't want to say he's a normal guy, but you would never know he was involved in the kind of stuff he was.
Yeah, very interesting. He's even got that kind of that organized crime name too, Maury Lerner. It definitely has that feel to it.
Sort of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
It does. Well, good story, Mike. Really thought this one very intriguing. I'm surprised there hasn't been, and I mean, I guess every gangster movie kind of has this story, but surprised there hasn't been some kind of story developed from this. Would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, because it's it involves athletic success, like I said before.
Yeah, the major crime family.
Sort of. Yeah, a criminal sort of developing as the years go on, connections to the mob. Being a hitman always has a Hollywood element to it. And just in general, him getting off after 18 years. You know, I would think it would make a good movie, at the very least, a good documentary.
Yeah, very cool. All right, Mike, let's get out of here on that note. Thanks for telling this story. If you have another athlete you'd like us to look up and research and tell you their true crime story, please leave a comment. Let us know on YouTube. Connect with us on Twitter. You can find us online at distantreplaypodcast.com and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks, Mike.
Yep, and this, I should have mentioned, this was a listener recommendation, so we do
Nice.
read those. There is a list. After getting a tip on our page about him, I started looking into him more, and that's how this episode came to be. So those recommendations you make are a huge help. Thanks as always for listening, and have a good one.